In the span of 9 days, two court decisions have fundamentally altered the architecture of American elections and setting the clock on democracy back by 6 decades. First, the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, the crown jewel of the civil rights movement, in a case brought by a January 6th participant. And yesterday, the Virginia Supreme Court threw out a voter-approved redistricting referendum that was meant to counter aggressive Republican gerrymandering elsewhere in the country. Together, these two decisions have turbocharged racist redistricting across the country, weakened Black and Latino voting power, as well as the voting power of white Democrats, and undermined the likelihood of a fair election this fall. The consequences are not abstract. Republicans could net as many as 16 to 18 additional seats in Congress without getting any more votes from the redistricting wars that are now underway. 6 states and counting have already answered Trump's call to redraw their maps for maximum Republican partisan advantage. Louisiana delayed its own primary to rush through new doctored maps. As recently as 2 days ago, Tennessee has eliminated its only Democratic congressional district. And yesterday, Republicans in South Carolina advanced legislation to delay the state's congressional primaries for 2 months while they draw out of existence the only district represented by a Black House member, the Democratic Congressman James Clyburn, who was arrested protesting segregation in the 1960s. In a post on X, Congressman Clyburn wrote, quote, "Republicans are trying to break apart South Carolina's 6th district, not because voters demanded it, but because Donald Trump requested it," end quote. As one Democratic strategist put it, Pandora's box has been opened and doesn't have a lid. This is not democracy. This is the engineering of elections by people who know they cannot win an election fairly conducted by a population fairly represented. Republican strategists are acknowledging the issue in their own circles. The head of the Republican State Leadership Committee warned donors in an internal memo last month that the group was, quote, facing a political environment that is likely to be one of the most challenging for state Republicans in recent years, end quote. The GOP's response to widespread political discontent is not to heed their sinking poll numbers, not to stand up to Trump's authoritarianism, but rather to lean into the most unpopular governing agenda in recent American history. Shortly after the Virginia Supreme Court ruling on Friday, Democratic Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia had this to say, quote, "The timing of this ruling speaks volumes. The U.S. Supreme Court eviscerates the Voting Rights Act in a lawsuit brought by a January 6th extremist, and southern states race to craft backroom deals disenfranchising minority voters and candidates. Meanwhile, Virginia voters chose to stand up against national disenfranchisement, only to see their votes cast into the trash by a 4-3 ruling," end quote. Kaine's anger captures the bigger crisis that is playing out. We're not watching isolated incidents. We're not watching a chaotic administration stumble into politics and policies that happen to hurt Black America. We're watching a coordinated project laid out explicitly in Project 2025 to effectively weaken Black and non-white political power and restore a version of white political supremacy to American institutions. And it's working. For now. Here on Velshi, we've reached the point where we're covering in real time the latest fortress to fall in the war to unravel Black political gains, racial equality, and a true multiracial democracy. This is what the GOP under Trump has become, a party that simply circumvents the will of the people, that bulldozes independent agency decisions and regulatory frameworks that protect ordinary Americans, that fires officials who refuse to serve a would-be king. Every vulnerable population you can think of, farmers, veterans, student loan borrowers, consumers, activists, dissenters, small business owners, journalists, university students, women authors, LGBTQ Americans, people of color. This administration has come for their rights and their protections, and when the private companies refuse to carry out that same authoritarian agenda, they are effectively extorted into doing so. When the Republican Party wants to impose its will on an unwilling public, the Republican Party simply dispenses with the public altogether. And while all of this is happening, a portion of the White House, the People's House, has been turned into a billionaire's den, a monument to the oligarchic triumph over our democratic guardrails, propped up by the president's MAGA cheerleaders on the Supreme Court. The legal analyst Elie Mystal recently talked about what this moment feels like as a black parent. He described conversations with his young kids, how he's now preparing them to, quote, live with a version of whiteness that is so much more virulent than what I had growing up. It is a weird thing as a parent to feel like you were the lucky ones and your kids are the unlucky ones, end quote. The consequences unleashed by Trump and his GOP are not abstract. They are felt by black parents who are now having to calculate what their children will have to do to survive. The journalist, historian, and professor Nikole Hannah-Jones calls what we are living through the second nadir, a reference to the original nadir of American race relations, that period after the collapse of Reconstruction when literally every gain that black Americans had fought for was systematically dismantled. Voting rights were stripped away. Political representation was eliminated. Economic progress was reversed. Violence was used as enforcement. We have been here before as a country. And this is what history teaches us. The dismantling of democracy in America has always started with the targeting of black America. Always. The erosion begins there and it spreads. The original nadir of the late 19th century was not just a racial rollback. It coincided with the Gilded Age, an era of extreme wealth consolidation and oligarchic power that took shape, ironically, just as Reconstruction was collapsing. The stripping of black political power and the rise of the robber barons were not separate stories. They're the same story. And we're living that same story today. Dehumanization is an addictive sport for the power hungry. And when you lower the bar for one population, it's just a small step from there to the rest of us. Gerrymandering is now the single most consequential issue for voter agency in this country. And yet, some corners of the Democratic Party are still tied in knots about whether the party and its candidates are too progressive, all while extremist Republicans are literally dismantling the architecture of democracy around them. Your vote is being diluted. Its power is being watered down. It's being tossed out before you even cast it. And the many of the most powerful people who should be sounding that alarm at full volume are sitting in a corner swatting at yarn. The blueprint for dismantling our multiracial democracy has been rolling out since day one of Trump's second term, and the pace is accelerating. On his first day back in office, the president declared war on diversity programs in government, in schools, on college campuses, in law firms, in private business. Then came the firings. The black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the black woman librarian of Congress, members of federal regulatory boards, not because of performance, but because of who they were, or perhaps because of what they looked like. It wasn't just people of profile. When DOJ began shredding the federal workforce, the cuts weren't random. A new lawsuit asserts that 75% of black officials at independent agencies have been fired under Trump. Black women have been hit the hardest. According to the Institute for Women's Policy Research, black women saw a more than 30% decrease in federal employment in 2025, compared to an 11.6% drop for all women and 8.1% for men. 30%. The New York Times noted that nothing has moved backward this far and this fast for black Americans in the federal government since 1912, when the racist President Woodrow Wilson resegregated the federal workforce. The standard of living for black households and black-owned small businesses dropped measurably in 2025 as a direct result of these targeted policies, including the tariffs and the mass layoffs. And those numbers are a canary in the coal mine, a warning of how the harm being done to black households may spread throughout the broader economy. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. Here's the central point. Trump and his administration have been bad at a remarkable number of things. They're terrible on the economy. They're terrible in the courts on most matters. They're terrible at diplomacy. They're terrible at governance. But on race, on the targeted dismantling of black political power and the reassertion of white male dominance, they have been wildly effective. And beneath all of this runs a current that this country still struggles to name. Black Americans were never, ever given the same starting line. After slavery, the promise of land was broken. After Jim Crow, there was redlining, predatory lending, a GI Bill from which black veterans were turned away. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the typical white family today holds roughly 10 times the wealth of the typical black family. 10 times. That gap didn't happen by accident. Every time momentum toward closing that gap between whites and blacks builds, the backlash arrives. Reconstruction, dismantled. The civil rights era answered with Nixon's Southern strategy, Reagan's war on drugs, the myth of the welfare queen, the election of America's first black president answered by the white grievance movement that propelled Donald Trump to power. What we are watching right now is not new at all. It is the same pattern, turbocharged. The Trump administration rescinded a 60-year-old executive order banning federal contractors from racial discrimination. It rescinded the clause in federal contracts prohibiting segregated facilities, restaurants, waiting rooms, drinking fountains. It purged black authors from federal libraries and from military institutions. Give them guns and train them to fight and die for this country, but do not dare let them read about their own history. And now this government is weaponizing the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the agency that was created by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to protect workers from discrimination, turning it into an instrument of white grievance that files suits against companies on behalf of white men who claim they were passed over for DEI hires. The scholar Kimberly Crenshaw has spent her entire career naming this bigoted machinery. She coined the term intersectionality to describe how systems of discrimination don't operate independently, one at a time. Rather, they overlap. They are mutually supportive. She helped build the field of critical race theory, which simply asks, what is the law actually doing and to whom? In a moment when the government is erasing black history from the official record, when black political power is being dismantled in real time, when black unemployment is spiking, her life's work has never been more urgent or more under attack.